Hi everyone, and thanks for having me here. I think that we all agree that AI introduces a new human era, but at the same time, I think that we witness the same type of challenges with other technologies in the past, and that is that technology advances much more faster than the law. And of course, the law is of course important because it sets out the necessary norms and principles and ethics. And AI, of course, has a direct and substantial impact on ethics. And so we will definitely see within this year probably the new or the first law that would set out the boundaries and some principles associated with using and developing AI technology. So all you developers and users, just be ready for it, that you will need to record and to document what you do and to be transparent with it, and the ability to explain it, and of course to make sure that there are no adverse effects, bad effects associated with what you do in terms of AI. But I'm here today not to talk about the future, but rather to focus on our day-to-day. And I think that our day-to-day is all about, I think that there's probably no company or no tech company in Israel that does not use some form of generative AI. And I wanted to share with you some of the experience that we've already gained through actual work and some brainstorming. It's a work in progress, of course. And some development that essentially the idea would be to have companies use these types of tools, but use it responsibly, meaning make the benefit out of it, but do it in some form of control over how we use these types. So I'd like to start with just a couple of examples. So I asked ChatGPT, the free version, to draft a biography about myself, and it provided that I was born in '75 in Jerusalem, and at the age of 10 I started developing to be a software developer, and that I was the owner of Conduit, and I managed 600 people. There's no shred of truth in any of the facts presented in it. So that's, just to show that, factual issues on generative AI tools is indeed an issue. By the way, when I asked Bing, the chat through Bing developed or produced some more accurate descriptions, the ChatGPT-4, the licensed for fees licensed version of ChatGPT does have some more reliable facts, but generally speaking, I think that it's not ripe yet to really rely on these tools in terms of what's right and wrong. So I'm really handling a lot of mostly technology-related aspects, the legal, ethical, regulatory, strategic aspects of these fields, and that's essentially what I do. And of course, if a lawyer speaks, I cannot, continue without laughing at our profession. And that's just happened last month, a few weeks back. A lawyer, an American U.S. lawyer, Stephen Swartz, submitted some sort of a motion or a document to the court using ChatGPT. He cited 12 court cases that did not exist. And as a result, he was fined, but I think that the embarrassment was much larger than the fine itself. So that's just, another example why we need to be cautious about factual issues. So that leads me to one, particular issue that we are very much, thinking about and discussing, and that is what's the origin of the data sets that these tools are using and how reliable they are, how we can rely on them. And at the moment, and that's again sort of an output from ChatGPT, these tools do not really disclose where do they scrape or collect the data that they use in order to train their models. So this is a sort of a question mark, and the question mark has some consequences. And here's a few consequences at the moment. What we see is that for the past 6 months, there were a few major class actions. Class actions meaning a lawsuit that a single person files on behalf of a large group of individuals, and therefore class actions are usually, at least in the US, by the billions of dollars. And this class action, this specific class actions was filed last week in California, in a California court, arguing that essentially that's against OpenAI, arguing that the data sets that OpenAI uses in order to train their model essentially violate individuals' privacy because the data itself contains a lot of personal information, and those people that personal information relates to them, they don't even know about it. So if they don't know about it, how they can agree with it, et cetera. So that's a sort of a privacy, $3 billion class action on privacy-related issues. But of course, privacy is not the only issue that is currently on debate. Well, maybe a couple of words more about the privacy issue. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, we see a lot of regulatory actions. It started with the Italian Data Protection Authority, and thereafter we've seen the Spanish one and the German one and the Austrian one, all initiating probes, initiating investigations on generative AI tools, specifically in relation to that question. Where do you get the data from, and how it is compliant with data protection laws that are meant to protect the privacy of individuals. So that's undergoing as well in Europe. But as I said, privacy is of course not the only issue around these tools. Just about half a year ago, on the November 2022, a class action was filed on copyright matters against Copilot. Copilot is, of course, using GitHub open source software repository in order to provide its outputs. And the idea was, or the claims that essentially it's not just about training models, it's about the fact that the outputs essentially, in some cases at least, copy some of the code, some of the software code that is part of the GitHub repository, and therefore when we're talking about open source license, of course you can do it because it's permissive. However, you need to provide attribution to the developers of the software, and this is of course not something that is being done by Copilot, and therefore this is another sort of a pending class action around mass infringement of IP rights. So that's another thing, and the attorney that filed a class action, a guy named Matthew Butterick, claimed that it is an unprecedented open source software piracy. We're very good lawyers with putting some drama into our papers that we submit to courts. And last, these are just examples. These are not the only claims, of course, that will file against generative AI, but I think that it was important to me to present another one, which is against those image-related, design-related tools, such as, in this case, Stable Diffusion and Midjourney. Very common, very popular with marketing teams, with creative teams in companies. And again, this is again a copyright class action arguing that essentially these tools not just train their models on images that they scrape or collect from somewhere, but essentially the output can be, at least in some cases, very similar to the original works. And when we talk about original works, they're copyrighted. And this is just an example from a very interesting research that scholars from NYU and Maryland University has conducted, and show that at least in some cases, yes, there is some sort of identity or similarity, so to speak, between outputs of these tools to original known works. This is a sort of, I think that we have a few thoughts that we can share and think about as a result. First of all, California. California is a sort of not just a sort of a tech giant base, but also to a large extent they produce the novel case law, the novel court opinion and decisions around technology, and this is what we're likely to see in relation to generative AI as well. All 3 class actions were filed in California. So that's one issue. The other is that, as we see, it's not just about targeting the database or the data sets used by these tools, and this is a sort of a liability or potential liability of the developers or the those companies like OpenAI that offer these tools, but rather the liability or the potential risk associated with these tools is relevant to the outputs as well, and that means that we as users of the outputs can be in somewhat risk as well. So that's another thought that we need to take into consideration. So we have copyright, we have IP issues, at least potential ones. It's just claims. We don't know what would be the outcome. We know that OpenAI, for example, submitted a motion to the California court to quash the claim, and we're still pending a decision by the court whether the court would agree to hear the case. So that's, but that's still a sort of at least a potential risk that we need to take into consideration. So IP and privacy matters, and yeah, try to use DALL-E in order to produce something that would write false or truth with the scale, with the meter, but DALL-E is not very good with text, so that was the outcome. But essentially, false truth, false facts is another issue that we definitely need to take in mind. Another issue would be, and that's a good example by a guy named Stephen Piantadosi. He published it on Twitter, and he showed a sort of test case. He asked ChatGPT to write a Python program on whether a person should be tortured based on their country of origin. And as you can see, if the person is from North Korea or from Syria, for example, then yes, the answer would be yes, he needs to be tortured. I think that, well, of course, that's a sort of a half joke, because what it shows, what it demonstrates is that essentially these tools reflect or even echo bias, because the bias already exists in the data sets. The data sets themselves were written by humans, collected, generated. This is something that was argued against search engines in the past as well. And we see it in generative AI tools as well, meaning that bias and discrimination is another issue that we need to consider in relation to the type of output that we receive and the way that we will use it as a consequence. This is, I would say, another risk or another factor that we need to take into consideration. And maybe the last one that I want to put an emphasis on is rather on the sides of what we actually enter generative AI tools. The type of text or the type of requests that we enter could potentially be company confidential information, that could be privacy, personal information. I can, enter just about anything that I want, and essentially, I can, violate or infringe on IP rights or secrecy, confidentiality, privacy. All these matters are important when I enter these types of prompts into generative AI tools. And the real question is, what do I do with it? I mean, there are some risks. They're not certain, at least potential risks. It doesn't necessarily mean that I would stop using it, but I need to be minded to it in order to, it's a sort of a risk management aspect that we need to take to take control of. So some companies and some universities and some companies has decided that they would not. They ban the use of these tools altogether. But usually these type of institutions or companies that do ban the use of them have alternatives. Large companies would use their own repositories and their own data in order to generate their own AI-based technology in order to make the benefit of it without using those of general use. But most of us don't do that. So generally, from my experience, companies in Israel, all of the companies that I've encountered with and worked with, they all use it, for all sorts of use cases. So what do? And that's just in a nutshell, and be happy afterwards to provide this some more context. We need to create a sort of a structure to use it responsibly, and responsible meaning make the benefit of it, but have some form of control in order to minimize the risks until the legal atmosphere around generative AI tools would be more concrete and more reliable. So it's about creating an assessment. It's about identifying the need, identifying the use cases, looking at the contracts associated with these tools, looking at the relevant IP-related matters, confidentiality, all of the aspects that I've already talked about. This is something that we need to have a sort of a process, internal process, in order to assess the specifics of these issues in relation to what we want to do with these tools. And thereafter, just simply manage it through simple concepts of control and compliance, meaning be on top of the developments of the legal and ethical developments around AI. Build a policy, build guidelines that your developers, for example, or your marketing can use. Have control of the process. Have someone own it. Own the process, be in charge of it, provide some further guidance along the line on an ongoing basis. Create awareness, train your people, gather them around and talk about it and hear what they have to say and have them listen to what you have to say and come up with the right ideas and the right concept that they can use and benefit from these tools, but at the same time, it will be somewhat controlled and while using risk reduction. So 3 tips, general tips. There are some differences between the paid for and the free types of generative AI tools in practice and in relation to risk reduction. Consider it. The third is, at least now, don't rely on facts coming from these tools. Simply do not do that. They're not reliable enough. And as I said, and the third is, it's not about building some sort of a boilerplate type of guidelines. It's about setting the right guidelines that would fit your specific purposes. Thanks a lot.